Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to provide an overview of the EuroMemo 2023, I guess in my capacity as having been the general editor this year. And Marika was mainly responsible for the macroeconomic chapter and Heike for the international chapter, and they will elaborate on that, but I'll provide an overview. And I thought I would start by just, oops, I am pressing down, it's not happening. You probably have the magic touch. So I thought I'd start with just a few comments on the basic structure of the annual EuroMemorandum, which you probably know, but it might be worthwhile just reminding ourselves. It provides an analysis of the political economic developments of the EU and its global environment. It shadows and critiques actual EU policies, and it proposes radical policy alternatives that are informed by the value premises pertaining to full employment with good work, social justice, eradication of poverty, social exclusion, ecological sustainability, and international solidarity. This is my own personal take on it. I like to think of it as a kind of a provisional utopia. And I kind of invoke who was supposed to be the first Minister of Finance of a Keynesian budget in the 1930s, the Swedish Minister of Finance, Ernst Wigforss, who was also the great ideologue of the Swedish Social Democratic Party. And I think there is an element to the way that Gramsci adopted the Sorelian notion of myth in this as well. So a provisional utopia should be something that is practically possible, but not, given the political and social forces presently, realistic. But it provides a vision and a sense of direction that hopefully renders a development in that direction realistic by providing an orientation for the mobilization of the social forces that can relate to it. And I kind of like to think about it in those terms. Basically what the EuroMemo does, it has every year themes that are specific for annual developments, but it also has recurring themes. And for example, what we've seen in a recurring way in EuroMemorandum over recent years has been a critique of financial capitalism and broadly Eurofederalist and internationalist alternatives. Few words on the title, European Polycrisis, Struggles for Survival, Climate and Energy Justice. The concept of polycrisis, I actually think the first one who invoked it was Marika, and we all thought that was great, so we did it. And I think you referenced Adam Tooze on it. And basically what it is, we suggest that the neoliberal order is in now profound crisis, and it manifests itself in terms of what we can call a polycrisis. A lot of things, crisis, and a lot of different dimensions. So Tooze's definition, which we thought was sensible, is that the multiplicity of shocks feeding each other with growing complexity. The shocks may appear disparate, but interact, such as the whole becomes even more overwhelming than the sum of the parts. And these are some of the aspects of polycrisis that we're talking about: climate change, the COVID-19 pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the energy crisis, the cost of living crisis, the emergent hegemonic rivalry between the United States and China, the care crisis in Asian societies, which is really a crisis of social reproduction, social inequalities, and crisis of democracy. These are some of the things that we do for many years, and some of them are new, and they're, from year to another we've focused it. But we thought that, thinking about all these things together, so hence the concept of polycrisis. There are 4 chapters in this EuroMemorandum, which it tends to be. There is a chapter on the macroeconomic outlook, a chapter on dealing with the cost of living crisis, a chapter on the climate crisis and the need for rapid socio-ecological transformation, and finally a chapter on the global disorder and its repercussions on the future of the EU. So what I think I'll do is I'll just say some very few, a number of headline things on chapter 1 and 4, which then of course will be elaborated upon by Marika and Heikki. And then I will say some more things about 2 and 3, which we will not have a detailed discussion on. So in terms of the macroeconomic outlook, the headlines there is, the return of inflation and a critique of the response of the EU, which mainly has been, and the ECB, which mainly has been on the monetary policy side, the rise of interest rates and so on and so forth, and an argument for price controls in key sectors, particularly food and energy, would have been a more appropriate policy, and also to address the inflation through fiscal policy and a change in the inflationary target rate. We related this to a major argument that we made over a number of years now, that the sort of the key plank for a socio-ecological transformation should be a major public investment program as an alternative to the European Green Deal, emphasizing federal fiscal transfer mechanisms and a democratization of forms of governance. And there is a sort of a subheading on the Growth and Stability Pact there. So then the dealing of the cost of living crisis, I'll say a few things about that in a minute. The same thing with the climate crisis. In the global disorder and its repercussions on the future of the EU, I think the key theme there is that there is a connection between the neoliberal model of development and the emergent geopolitical conflicts that, of course, in particular in Europe, takes itself the form of the war in Ukraine. And I hope that I'm okay with Heikki to kind of characterize the basic analysis here is that this is a manifestation of inadequate institutions in the final analysis. And the dynamic is more in line with Polanyi's double movement, and perhaps drawing also on Piketty here, rather than Ernst Haas's notion of spillover effects. So neoliberal forms of development is actually generating more social and political conflicts that also take geopolitical manifestations, rather than the liberal idea that economic integration will, in an evolutionary way, provide a basis for interdependence and peaceful coexistence at the social and political level. And that is essentially a question of inadequate institutions, and in the final analysis also the forces underlying the creation of those institutions. So those are the 4 chapters. Dealing with the cost of living crisis. This chapter, the chapters always have to be seen in relation to one another, and this chapter needs to be seen very much in line with the macroeconomic chapter. The chapter actually acknowledges some important relative progress in the social field in European policy development. So, the action plan for European Pillar of Social Rights, the Directive of Adequate Minimum Wages, the Commission proposal and the Council recommendation on adequate minimum income, and the European Care Strategy are seen as a relatively progressive development. But it is difficult to see how this can be reconciled with a general thrust of economic policy in the present, but also, of course, against the backdrop of austerity that goes back at least to the Eurozone crisis. Again, linking up to chapter 1, it is noted in this chapter that real wages are due to decrease on average 6.5% in 2022 and 2023, and there is no adjustment to the hardship on this in terms of increased social benefits. It points out that lower income households are especially hit by the increase of food prices and energy, etc., because of the particularities of the consumption baskets. And again, it points to the ongoing austerity in public services and the crisis of social reproduction. It calls for a rights-based approach rather than workfare. Appeals to wage increases and an indexation of minimum. And of course, this is not happening with the minimum wages. There is no indexation mechanism of it. I mean, it also calls for a rights-based approach to benefits and public services hit by years of austerity. Moving on to the chapter on the climate crisis, the chapter starts by pointing out that we are approaching or have already passed the tipping points to for keeping global warming within 1.5 degrees, and we essentially have, as IPCC says, about 4.5 years of the carbon budget left, and this points to the urgent need for a 4.3 trillion investments globally by 2030. We then connect this to the complete inadequacies of current strategies, in particular in regards to the European Green Deal. There has been a recurring EuroMemo critique of the EGD relying on blended finance as an aspect of finance-led capitalism. And this year's EuroMemo on this score is amplifying is a lot more than previous Euromemos have done by looking much more in depth at how, if you will, global finance is operating or how green finance is operating. And there are really kind of two themes here. One is the domination of the big three financial companies, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, in green finance and managing $20 trillion with large shareholdings of fossil fuel corporations, supporting carbon major resolutions of AGVs. So really, from that point of view, green finance is more a kind of a marketing mechanism, whereas in fact, they are still very, very much vested and invested in the carbon majors. The other theme here is the neo-voluntarist and soft regulation spectacle is, I think, the term that Sarah Bracken used in her keynote at the conference. How green finance is based on neo-voluntarism and soft regulation, and that green asset forms are, very much integrated into the finance centered around the City of London. So the certification of these kind of assets are self-labeled, so the providers really kind of define green finance themselves. They are based on the idea of a notional financing gap, which is based on retrofitting existing built environments, whereas the built environment, etc., would actually need to be radically transformed. The chapter also briefly talks about the ecological limitations of the Chinese model of development and the Belt and Road, and then relate this to geopolitical developments that then are elaborated in chapter 4. So basically what I've done is I've just provided an overview and a bit of an elaboration on chapter 2 and 3, which are not presented in detail here, but I now leave it to Marika to do the macro and Heikki to do the international chapters. Thank you very much.